sure if we want a no-fly zone. I'm not sure, because of the history of no-fly zones and their distasteful use in other parts of the Middle East. And also the way in which I think you may have noticed that scores of people were killed yesterday in Afghanistan by NATO bombing raids. So, personally, I'm a bit skeptical about the issue of even the no-fly zone, simply because I don't trust NATO or the Americans or the British to do it in the way that we would like it to be done. And so the question is, so what exactly are we asking for? Are we asking, or should we be asking, for the rebel army or the people's army to be armed? Should we be trying, and this is where it becomes serious, it's a very serious question. What do we do? Do we try and smuggle arms over the border from Egypt? Do we try and smuggle arms over the border from Algeria, by boat from Malta? And who is going to do it? And does even that change the entire game? Does that make it another set of what? If we leave this to the Americans, will they turn them into a bunch of mujahideen, as they did in Afghanistan? There are very serious questions about how we, lucky as we are to sit and think about these things, as opposed to be implicated in them and have our lives at risk. There are very serious questions that we have to ask ourselves, because we are always talking about the notion of interventionism and internationalism, and we do care. And as Ahmed said, it is a war now, it is a war. So, I'll leave you with that question, that we are watching the collapse of an Arab state system, and we are now having to ask ourselves very serious questions about how we move forward, what we do for the people in Libya. It will be a protracted battle, a different kind of protracted battle than the protracted battle in Cairo or Tunis, but nonetheless possibly more urgent, much more urgent for us to come to a consensus about what it is we want. Okay? And if it is that we arm these people in order to defend themselves, then we have to start saying that quite clearly, and we have to understand what the implications of that are. But to end on a happy note, okay, just before, just not to leave it, it is absolutely momentous. It is so difficult. I know this is an international issue, and everybody can relate to what is going on, but it has been unbelievably frustrating being Arab for the last 20 to 40 years. It's been an awful label to carry because of the constant frustration and silencing and disenfranchisement and feeling that your nation is not yours, that your nation is lost, that you are powerless to do anything about it. And the fact that this is happening in my lifetime, in our lifetime, the fact that we have many years ahead of us, all of us, I think, we have many years ahead of us to watch this amazing change take place in the region, and to, as well, get rid of all those skeletons in the closet about the Middle East, and people with big beards, and women with veils, and it becoming this horrible place. We should all be very content that the calls in Cairo and Tunis and in Tarablis and Benghazi and in Sana'a and everywhere in the region are for dignity and participation and basic rights. Okay, nobody is talking about a khilafah. Nobody is talking about Islamic states. None of that is on the agenda. And I think that what that should do is it should make us always question the narratives that are used to explain this particular region, okay? Because we have been fed for a very long time a particular understanding of what this region represents for the rest of the world. Okay? And I think we should listen very carefully to the calls coming from those capitals, from those squares, and we should realize the common, as you're saying, the common humanity, the basic needs of people around the world, which are far from scary, far from alienating. There are things that we should welcome. And I'll leave there. Thank you.
Well, again, a very moving account from Ramy, and it makes you think that what is happening now and what we've seen so far completely puts the lie to the idea that in the Middle East they're out there awaiting the terrorists who want to destroy us. You know, it might well be that it's our world which is the new security threat, fighting for its survival against all odds. But on that note, can I give the floor to Kamran?
Thank you. Initially, I thought I would just give you an account of recent development in Iran, and especially with respect to the Green Movement. But then I came across this question in the wiki space Andrew kindly created, and there was a question about whether we can draw parallels between Green Movement and the current democratic uprisings in the Middle East. And I thought that's a better actually framing, so I'm using that question to present my talk. Ramy referred to this dominant narratives about how Middle Eastern politics and society is described. And in the early days of Egyptian uprising, there was a very peculiar alignment of that discourse from kind of forces and peoples we would never normally associate with each other, i.e. Mubarak, Fox News, and Ahmadinejad. All three of them were saying, look, beware, this is Iran 1979, Iran, Islam is coming, you know, fundamentalism takes over and the whole, you know, civil life will be destroyed. So that was their trick to prevent people from joining and supporting what was going on. Now, the events, of course, told us that was completely untrue, and Muslim Brothers, the most arguably influential force in Egypt, was only conspicuous by its absence in terms of leading what was going on in Egypt. Having said that, I think we can actually compare and contrast the experience of Iran and Egypt and see whether there are things to be learned by both sides from each other's experience. So I will go through a series of what I consider to be important factors in this movement, and try to draw out the differences and similarities. The first is their objectives, this movement's objectives. In case of Egypt, it was from the start a radical demand for regime change, if you like. In Iran, however, Green Movement began with a modest demand for free elections and actually rectifying the disputed election in 2009. Now, since then, it has increasingly and systematically been radicalized, and I come back to that, partly as a result of what's happening in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world. The leadership of these movements are rather different as well. In Egypt, you don't have, or you didn't have at least during those momentous 18 days, no recognized leadership. It was mainly grassroots activists, youth workers, urban poor, coming together, or self-organization and leading the movement. In Iran, however, there was a symbolic and to some extent public face for the leadership of the movement, i.e. Mousavi al-Karoubi and a host of other ex-members of the Iranian Islamic Republic who were occupying very important positions, but then they were marginalized in the context of internal power struggle. However, this symbolic leadership were in touch, and they never claimed actually they were leading the movement, but they were saying we are just, you know, going along with the movement. And this movement at the grassroots was very similar to what's going on in Egypt. Horizontal networks, true social networks, internet being widely used, and various virtual spaces being created for debating and discussing the demands of the movement. In terms of strategy, in case of Egypt, you had sustained mass protest occupying key spaces in urban areas. Tahrir was the main and most symbolic space. In Iran, however, it's been ad hoc street demonstrations in large cities, which is consistent with the reformist agenda of Iranian elite since at least 97, when Khatami was first elected to office of presidency. And they formulated their strategy as pressure from below, haggling at the top. So for them, people were important so long as they exercised the pressure so that they could actually negotiate among themselves at the top of the regime about who gets what. Now, as this movement has been prolonging, actually that strategy is collapsing under the weight of contradictions of that movement itself, as demands are getting radicalized from below. And in many ways, people and the movement itself is kind of overtaking and leaving behind its own reformist leadership. In terms of discourse, therefore, it's very similar to the difference between strategy. In Egypt and Tunisia, you had from the beginning very radical political, but also economic and social demands. Change, freedom, social justice. They were very central to the whole movement. And also use of legitimate violence in self-defense. In Iran, however, the whole movement so far being highly political. The demands are simply political. And that is really its weak point insofar as it cannot or hasn't been able to mobilize the large number of urban poor and workers in the country. Moreover, in case of Iran, the whole movement, at least from the reformist leadership, it's trying to change or reform through the existing institutions and constitution, in contrast to Egypt, where the change of constitution and the regime itself was the main demand. In terms of role of Islam, which is obviously often being referred to as important, in Egypt it was very clearly a secular democratic movement, and it involved all sorts of groups, Coptic, for example, community played a very important role. In Iran, the situation is slightly different because the regime itself is an Islamic republic, one of the first successful Islamic states being established as a result of popular revolution. So inevitably, the oppositional movement's discourse cannot be identical. That's not to say that Islam has no role in the oppositionist movement's discourse, but it's been thoroughly reworked, and what you have now, it's a kind of, it's difficult to label it, but we could say some sort of liberal reformist Islam, but it is increasingly getting allied, willingly or otherwise, with leftist and secular nationalist forces. Another important aspect, I think, is the regime's support in these countries and their instruments of sustaining their rule. Regime support, I think, in Egypt, and maybe Ramy can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to be very socially ruthless, very similar to the Iran in the 70s under the Shah. But Iranian regime, being the product of a popular revolution, has still quite considerable social support. It's small, a minority, but highly organized, very motivated, and very dispersed within the society. And that's one reason why it's been so difficult